Chapter 21. There's Lando, Leia said, pointing out the canopy as Han sat there at Incom T-81 down on the Orawood Tower's third-level airspeeder pad. Over there, by the entryway, behind that red cloud car. Yeah, I see him, Han grunted, shutting down the repulsor lifts. I still think this is a bad idea, Leia. I know you do, Leia said, taking a moment to look past the lighted landing area at the darkened shrubbery perimeter beyond it. There was no one visible, either to her eyes or her Jedi senses. And I can't say I completely disagree with you, but he insisted on coming. You just better hope Dexano didn't get wind of it and have someone follow him here, Han growled, popping the canopy. You get someone yelling secret meeting and we'll all have had it. I know, Leia said, climbing out of the airspeeder and looking around. There were some airspeeder running lights visible in the sky around them, and the various roads crisscrossing the area around the tower were carrying their usual quota of land speeders. None of the vehicles seemed to be particularly heading their direction, but there were the darkened windows of one of the tower's 5 tap cafes gazing down on them from the 4th floor, not to mention all the windows of the apartments stretching up into the night sky. If one of those windows concealed someone with a set of macro binoculars, Han clearly had already had the same thought. We'd better get inside, he muttered, taking her arm. Come on, 3PO. Move it. Yes, sir, the golden-skinned droid said hastily, levering himself awkwardly out of the back of the airspeeder and shuffling quickly behind him. That was the first time 3PO had said anything, Leia realized suddenly, since they'd left the Imperial Palace. Had he picked up on Han's mood and was trying to make himself inconspicuous? Or had he been brooding on his own memories of Thrawn's last bid for power? Lando emerged from his half-concealment as they approached. Han? Leia? He nodded to them. His usual smile of greeting, Leia noted, was conspicuously absent. Where's Card? He's already here, Leia told him as Han keyed the entryway lock. The Nogri let him in. Good. Hunching his shoulders beneath his cloak, Lando threw one last look back into the darkness as he followed Leia in. 38 stories tall, the Orawood Tower had originally been planned to be the nucleus of an elaborate and extensive colony of Alderaanians who had been off-planet when the first Death Star destroyed their world. But though the architects had painstakingly crafted every facet of the tower to fit the Alderaanian style, Coruscant's crowds and near-total land development were simply too alien to their life view for most of the refugees to feel comfortable living there. Though the rest of the project had been abandoned, there had been hopes that enough Alderaanians would remain on Coruscant to keep the tower itself occupied, particularly given its spectacular view of the Minari Mountains. But that final dream had been dealt its death blow by Grand Admiral Thrawn's short-lived but terrifying siege of the planet. When the siege was finally lifted, virtually all the Alderaanians left Coruscant, going to do Alderaan or scattering out among the stars. As one of them had explained to Leia, they had been lucky enough to escape the destruction of one world, and had no desire to settle on an even more tempting target. And so the grand experiment had settled into vague obscurity, joining the host of other residential centers clustered beneath the mountains, most of which provided secondary or vacation homes to rich industrialists or government officials. Off-worlders and aliens, most of whom had never even heard of the fabled Oro Woods of Alderaan, let alone never walked among them. Over the years, the ache of that irony had mostly faded from Leia's heart. Mostly. The turbolift operated with the typical quiet efficiency of Alderaanian construction, depositing them into the lush garden scene that comprised the 30th floor lobby. No one was visible among the fronds and rock pile water trickles, but then no one was supposed to be. Barkimk? Leia called softly. I am here, Lady Vader, Barkim's voice mewed from across the lobby. There was a rustle from the fronds, and the Nogri warriors stepped into view beside the archway that opened into the corridor leading to their apartment. All is quiet. Thank you, Leia said. Make sure you keep it that way, Han added as they crossed the lobby. Barkimk bowed his head. I obey, Han Clan Solo. Card was lounging in a plush, self-molding contour chair in the apartment's conversation circle, a data pad in one hand and a glass of amber liquid in the other as Han keyed the door open. Ah, there you are, the smuggler said, closing the data pad and levering himself out of the chair as they filed inside. I was just thinking of asking Skish to try contacting you. We got a later start than I'd expected, Leia explained. I'm sorry. No need to apologize, Card assured them. The children aren't with you? They just left this morning with Chewie to go visit his family on Kashyyyk, Leia told him. With all that's been happening lately, I thought it would be better for them to be there. Between their Nagri Guard and a planet full of Wookiees, it's hard to imagine any place safer, Card agreed. Hello, Calrissian. Nice to see you again. Yes, Lando said. Though you may not think so when we tell you why we're here. Card's expression didn't change, but Leia could feel a tightening of his emotions. Really, he said easily. Let's dispense with the formalities, then. Sit down and tell me all about it. I'm sorry, the screening system at the other end of the comm said in its maddeningly pleasant mechanical voice. Communication with the residents you request is restricted. I cannot connect you without a proper authorization code. Tell Councilor Organa Solo that it's an emergency, Shada said, putting the most intimidating official tone into her voice that she could as she gazed out the Tap Cafe window at the Solo's Incom T-81, sitting there on the Arrowwood Tower's third-floor landing pad. I'm calling under the authorization of Admiral Drayson of New Republic Intelligence. The screening system remained unfazed. I'm sorry, but I cannot connect you without a proper authorization code, it repeated. Grimacing, Shada keyed the comm off. That had been the last verbal gambit in her repertoire, and it had done nothing but get her to the same runaround. The same thing every time she tried, and she was beginning to get very tired of it. She'd tried the polite, official way first, calling Councilor Organa Solo's office at the Imperial Palace, and, when the screeners there wouldn't let her through either, trying to get into the massive governmental building itself. But with no official status or business or connections to call on, she'd hit meter-thick transparent steel walls at every turn. She'd tried calling the Solos' main home outside the palace next, with the same results. And now she tried to get through to them on their Minara Mountain retreat, again with no luck. And with each rebuff, her obviously idealized vision of the new Republic had crumbled a little bit more. She'd hoped they would have more to offer her than the life with the Mistral that she'd turned her back on. It was starting to look more and more like she'd been mistaken. But there was nothing to do now but continue what she'd started, if for no other reason than that there was nowhere left for her to go. So all right, she'd tried it the polite way and gotten nowhere. Now she would try it the Mistral way. The tower's second-floor shopping complex was quite extensive, and it took her no more than 5 minutes to collect the 3 items she needed. 1 minute after that, armed with a length of brocaded white ribbon, a cheap datapad, and a bottle of equally cheap but awesomely strong Dodbury whiskey, she was in the turbolift heading up. It would be a short ride, she knew, but she already had the details mapped out in her mind and set to work with no wasted motions. Popping the cap off the whiskey, she splashed a little of the potent concoction onto the collar of her slightly bedraggled ankle-length dress, and then sipped a little into her mouth. Wincing at the tingle, she swished it around while she poured the rest of the bottle into the decorative flower boxes that ran around the upper part of the car. She spat her mouthful back into the bottle, glad to be rid of it, then turned her attention to the ribbon. The traditional Coruscant wedding hair bow was tricky to tie, but she knew a variant that would be quick and simple and looked enough like the real thing to fool anyone but an experienced observer. By the time the doors opened onto the tower's rooftop observation deck, she was ready for her performance. Bottle clutched in one hand, datapad in the other, she stepped out of the car and threw a casual and calculatedly unsteady look around. No one was visible among the deserted tables and chairs and decorative shrubbery, but then the group of personal guards that surrounded Councilor Organa Solo seldom were. Getting a fresh grip on her bottle, she set off in a staggering walk for the edge of the roof. The guard she knew had to be there hadn't made his appearance by the time she reached the chin-high latticework guardrail set into a solid knee-high base. So fine, Ravis, she muttered to herself in a slurred and despondent voice as she dropped the bottle and datapad onto the roof beside the guardrail. You don't wanna, huh? Fine. If I get out of your life, if that's what you want, I can get all the way out. She broke off with a single underplayed sob. Digging her fingers into the holes of the lattice, she pressed herself against the barrier and twisted her head sideways to peer over and down at the ground below, her senses alert. There was a single whisper of sound from behind her, and then nothing. So they were going to need more from her before they made any move. Fine. She could oblige them. Extracting her fingers from the guardrail, continuing to sob softly under her breath, she retrieved the datapad and set it down on a nearby chair, propping it up to be clearly visible. With slightly fumbling fingers, she pulled the wedding bow out of her hair, kissed it theatrically, and placed it down in front of the datapad. She took another moment to carefully arrange the two items together. Then, squaring her shoulders, she took a deep breath and stepped back to the roof edge. Gripping the lattice again, she climbed up onto the base and swung one leg over the top of the guardrail. Or rather, tried to. Even as she swung the leg up, she heard another whisper of sound, and a hand suddenly grabbed her waist sash, tucking her backward and forcing her to bring her leg back down to maintain her balance. Do not do this, a gravelly cat-like voice mewed softly from behind her. Let me go, Shada moaned, letting go of the lattice with her left hand and slapping ineffectually at his arm. Let me go. He don't care about me. He says so. He doesn't want me anymore. Let me go. This is not the way, the Nogri said, pulling her gently but firmly. Come inside and we will speak. Done with talking, Shada muttered, half turning to look down at him and making sure he could smell the whiskey on her breath as she threw a quick glance over the rooftop. No one else was visible. Please, let me go, she pleaded, grabbing the lattice again with her left hand and pulling upward against his grip. Please. No, the Nogri repeated, pulling back with more strength than she would have thought a creature that small could manage. Her fingers strained against the pull, and without warning she let go, spinning halfway around as she fell straight at him. The Nogri was fast, all right. By the time she'd rotated far enough around to see him, he'd already moved a step to the side to get out of her way. His free arm came up, ready to catch her shoulders and break her fall, and as she fell into that wiry grip, her hand jabbed hard into the side of his throat. Without a sound, his legs buckled beneath him and they collapsed together onto the rooftop. For a few seconds she lay there, still sobbing drunkenly, her eyes darting around the rooftop for signs of a backup. But the Nogri was apparently up here alone. Which wasn't to say he hadn't checked in before rushing off to save the despondent drunk bent on self-destruction. If he had, she didn't have much time. If he hadn't, she wouldn't have much more. Stripping off the dress that had concealed her combat jumpsuit, keeping one eye on the turbolift door, she set to work. Card turned his glass around in his hand, his eyes on the remains of his drink as it swirled partway up the side in response to the movement. You're sure about all of this, he said. I'm sure, Lando said positively. I searched through what we've got of the old Imperial archives and found every recording they had of Thrawn. There wasn't much, but it definitely looked and sounded like the man I saw. Which doesn't mean it couldn't be a trick, Han put in, throwing a surreptitious look at Leia. If Card's attitude was all an act, if he was secretly behind this Thrawn sighting of Lando's, then she ought to have pulled the proof of that from his mind by now. But her face had the same grim expression that had been there when Lando first started his story, and even as he watched, her eyes shifted to his and she shook her head microscopically in response to his unspoken question. Han had thought they were being subtle enough. Apparently not. I take it I'm under some suspicion here, Card continued, still studying his glass. And not just from the Ashuri and their allies. Have I passed the test? Han looked at Leia again in time to see her lip twitch. I'm sorry, she said. For whatever it's worth, I had no doubts myself. Thank you. Card smiled slightly at Han and Lando. I won't embarrass either of you by asking if you shared the Councilor's confidence. I don't like taking anything for granted, Han told him, It's not like you've ever sworn allegiance to the New Republic or anything. Card inclined his head. You're right, of course. My apologies. He shifted his gaze to Lando. All right, then. Let's begin with the assumption we're all hoping is true, namely that you were the victim of a clever trick. First question, how was it done? Shouldn't be all that hard, Han said. Some facial surgery to make this guy look like Thrawn. Then just add in some skin, hair, and eye coloring. Facial surgery usually leaves distinctive marks, Lando pointed out. I know what to look for, and they weren't there. Besides, what about the voice? What about the voice? Han asked. Voices can be fake, too, you know. We did it ourselves with 3PO once, remember? If the voice was really that accurate, it could have been a human replica droid, Card suggested. Like the one Prince Shizor of Black Sun used to have. Lando shook his head. It wasn't just the voice, Card, or the face, or anything else you could look at. It was, I don't know. There was a presence there, a hidden power and confidence I don't think any droid could fake. It was him. It had to be. Could it have been a clone, then? Card persisted. Thrawn could easily have taken one or more of the cloning tanks out of Mount Tantus before it was destroyed. I've been wondering about that too, Leia said. It could also explain where the clones Luke sensed to Diffigen came from. A clone of Thrawn would be dangerous enough, Lando agreed tightly. But turn it around a minute. Couldn't it just as easily have been a clone sitting on the Chimera's bridge at Bilbringi? What if Thrawn had anticipated everything that was going to happen? Everything! And made the necessary arrangements. Card swished his drink around a little more in his glass. Then why did he sit back and let the Empire collapse when his leadership could very likely have saved it? He asked. No. If he really was alive, he must have been incapacitated by his wound and gone off somewhere to heal. That's pretty much what he implied to Myatamia and me, Lando agreed. He implied he'd been off recovering. Unless that's just what he wanted you to think, Leia warned. Maybe he was simply off doing something else instead. Instead of protecting the Empire? Han objected. That doesn't make sense. Abruptly, Card set his glass down on the low table beside his chair. All right, then, he said. Let's assume the worst case. That really was Thrawn you saw, and that he's back and out for blood. Why suddenly make an appearance now? And why just to you and Senator Myatamia instead of all of Coruscant? Probably to create exactly the situation we're in now, Leia said. The tension level in the Senate has jumped straight to the ceiling, with a tremendous amount of animosity and suspicion being focused on the Diamala, and by extension, to everyone on that side of the Kamas issue. With a hint that Gaversam might not want to resolve the crisis thrown in just to stir things up a little more, Lando added. I hear some of the senators are already complaining that he's been dragging his hooves on the whole question of reparations for the Kamasi. Han grimaced. The Bothan's financial crisis. He's doing the best he can, he told Lando. Maybe, Lando said darkly. But it strikes me that there are a lot of other ways Thrawn could have stirred up the government if that was all that he wanted. What else could he want? Card asked. He surely wouldn't be foolish enough to take on the entire New Republic, not with only 8 sectors worth of resources at his disposal. Maybe he's found a new superweapon the Emperor had stashed away somewhere, Lando suggested ominously. Another Death Star, a completed one this time. Or maybe another Sun Crusher. Or something even more dangerous. Card shook his head. Far-fetched. If there was something like that out there, we surely would have heard of it by now. There's another point that needs to be made here, Leia said. You talked about him taking on the entire New Republic, but that's only if we could get the entire New Republic together to fight him. With the Kamas issue dividing us so strongly, and with the Empire so weak that most people don't even think of it as a threat, that's not a given anymore. If it ever was, Han said sourly. There was never more than a small fraction of the galaxy actually fighting against the Empire. And never more than a small fraction of the Empire fighting against us, Lando pointed out, his eyes on Card. I don't think we realized back then just how much of their energy was going to keeping all of these little planetary vendettas and rivalries from blowing up in their faces. Now we're in that same situation, and in my opinion, we simply don't have the resources available to take on whatever Thrawn has planned. That, of course, depends on what he has planned, Card said. He was eyeing Lando closely, Han noticed suddenly, as closely as Lando was eyeing him. So what do you suggest is your next move? Our next move, Lando said, leaning on the word, is to get this blasted Kamas issue out of the way so we can focus on Thrawn. And that means finding out exactly who the guilty Bothans were. That could be a problem, Card said, his voice studiously calm. As far as I know, the Imperials have only two complete sets of records left. One at the Ubictorate base at Yaga Minor, the other at the current Imperial capital on Bastion. I don't suppose you'd happen to know where Bastion is, Leia said. I'm afraid not, Card said, glancing at her and then returning his attention to Lando. Bastion's proper name is one secret the Imperials have managed to keep. I wasn't necessarily talking about the Imperials, Lando said. I was thinking someone else might have the records we're looking for. Han blinked at Lando. Suddenly, the other's insistence that he join them here tonight for their talk with Card was taking on a whole new dimension. You mean that Card... I don't have the records, Calrissian, Card said. If I did, I'd have offered them to you long before now. I know that, Lando said, his voice heavy with significance. I was referring to a different source entirely, who also probably doesn't have them, Card said coldly. Lando's expression didn't change. But who might? For a pair of heartbeats, the two men continued to gaze at each other. Han threw a frown at Leia, saw his same puzzlement mirrored on her own face. Is there something else we need to know about? He asked carefully. No, Lando said. Or maybe I should say not yet. Leia, Calrissian and I need to have a short talk, Card said, getting abruptly to his feet. Is there a place where we can have some privacy? You can use the boys' bedroom, Leia said, pointing down the hallway. Last door on the left. Thank you. Card gestured Lando to the hallway. After you, Calrissian. Shada had added an extra anchor to her safety line about 2 meters above her, on the assumption that if and when the Nogri got reinforcements up to the rooftop, they might simply cut the line without bothering to haul her up first for the formality of questioning. Now, dangling 100 meters above the ground, she eased her low-light eyepiece around the edge of the darkened window beside her and peered inside. It was a child's bedroom. A children's bedroom, she corrected herself, spotting the second bed pushed against the far wall. Currently unoccupied, and since none of the three solo children had followed their parents out of the airspeeder, it was reasonable to assume the room would stay that way. Replacing the eyepiece into its jumpsuit pocket, she pulled out one of her three Zana M6W9 molecular stilettos and extended its invisibly slender blade. Like a lightsaber, a molecular stiletto could cut through nearly anything. Unlike a lightsaber, though, the Zana's blade was incredibly delicate. A quick thrust against an assailant nearly always resulted in a broken blade, along with a dead assailant, of course, and even the most painstakingly careful cutting job was as likely as not to end up ruining the tool. Fortunately, the task facing her wasn't going to be large enough to push the odds. With most buildings on Coruscant, she would have had to cut away an entire window to get inside, but the Orawood's designers had incorporated traditional Alderaanian swing-out panels to allow for free airflow. All she had to do was maneuver the stiletto blade between the panels and slice through the catch, and she would be in. After, of course, finding and disabling whatever alarms the Nogri had installed. That task turned out to be easier than she'd expected. The window carried only a single alarm, ranged to watch for incoming airspeeders. Apparently, it hadn't occurred to the Nogri that someone might be crazy enough to rappel down from the rooftop the way she had. Though, of course, to be fair, they had put a guard up there. 2 minutes later, she was inside the darkened room, pulling the window closed behind her and listening hard. There were the usual soft mechanical noises of any modern dwelling, along with the muffled sounds of conversation coming from elsewhere in the apartment. The words were impossible to decipher through the closed door, but she could hear at least four distinct voices. She stood just inside the door, frowning with sudden indecision. She'd seen Solo and Organa Solo and their droid arrive in their T-81, and had spotted Calrissian waiting for them. But who was the fourth voice? Some random friend who'd happened to drop in? Hardly. A business associate of Calrissian's. Maybe, except that he'd been skulking alone in the shadows before the Solos arrived. One thing was sure. Given how furtive all three of them had been behaving outside, this was clearly a meeting they'd taken great pains to keep secret. A meeting she doubted any of them would appreciate being crashed by a total stranger. Abruptly, she tensed. The conversation had paused, and in its place was a new sound. Footsteps, heading her direction. She was across the room in four quick strides, kneeling beside the bed by the far wall. It was a spaceship-style bed, with storage compartments filling the space beneath the mattress itself, but she hadn't planned on hiding under it anyway. Getting a grip on the storage handles, she pulled. There must have been a lot of junk in those drawers. Even Mistral honed muscles behind the tug of the behind the tug. The bed moved barely 25 centimeters away from the wall, but it would be enough. And at any rate, with the footsteps already passed outside her door, it would have to do. Lunging up from her kneeling position, she half dived, half rolled across the bed, and slid silently down on her side into the narrow gap. She just made it. Even as her shoulder and hip settled against the cool floor of the bedroom, door slid open and two sets of footsteps came inside. The glow panel blazed on, and the door closed again. "We had an agreement, Calrissian," an unidentified male voice said. Unidentified, yet definitely familiar. Shada searched her memory. "Which I haven't broken," Calrissian said, his voice sounding a little defensive. "Really?" the other asked coldly. "You're as good as told them there's a secret here. Do you think either of them needs more than that to gather their little shovels together and start digging?" And then abruptly the memory clicked. It was the smuggler chief, Talon Card. "Frankly, Card, I think they've both got more important things to worry about right now," Calrissian said tartly. "And to be honest, I never understood why you were so obsessed about secrecy on this thing in the first place. So George Cardass was once a competitor of yours." "Keep your voice down," Card growled. "I don't want the others hearing that name. And Cardass wasn't a competitor. It was something else entirely." "Fine," Calrissian said. "Whatever. The point is that we can't afford the luxury of silly games anymore. Not with—" "Silly games," Card cut him off. "Calrissian, you have no idea what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Calrissian retorted. "I'm talking about the genius who came this close to taking down the whole New Republic 10 years ago. Whatever Thrawn's got planned, he has to be counting on the Kamas issue to keep us divided." Shada felt her breath catch in her throat. Whatever Thrawn had planned? But Thrawn was dead. Wasn't he? "Thank you for the historical review," Card said. "I was there, if you'll remember. Let's not act like the whole New Republic's on the edge of desperation and collapse, though, all right?" "Are you sure we're not?" Calrissian countered. "After all this time, do you really think Thrawn would have shown himself if he wasn't ready to pounce?" "If he intends to pounce," Card argued. "There are many other things he could be planning besides an overt attack." "Oh, that's comforting," Calrissian growled. "And all the more reason to get the Kamas issue resolved as quickly as possible. If there's even half a chance Cardass can help, someone has to go see him." "And you're suggesting I should be that someone?" "You're the one who knew him," Calrissian pointed out. "That may not be an asset," Card said. "In fact, it could be quite the opposite." There was the soft sound of a slightly exasperated sigh. "Look, Card, I don't know what went on between you and Cardass. What I do know is that we're facing Grand Admiral Thrawn here. And not just us. You're facing him too. Don't forget, he specifically said he's coming after you." "Scare words," Card murmured. I don't remember Thrawn ever relying on scare words the last time, Calrissian said. Everything he said was backed up with action. But since you brought up the subject of scare words, what are you so afraid of, anyway? There was the sound of footsteps moving towards the window. You never met Cardass, Lando, Card said quietly. If you had, you'd understand. In his own way, he was more ruthless even than Jabba the Hutt. Yet you asked Mara and me to go hunt him down. I didn't ask you to do anything at all, Card said. If you'll recall, I tried to get you to sell me that beacon call outright. You also tried to tell me it was just some useless curiosity from pre-Clone Wars days, Calrissian reminded him dryly. You knew perfectly well I wouldn't fall for a story like that. Anyway, that's beside the point. We tracked him down and made it back just fine. Pardon me. You only tracked him as far as a likely system, Card said. You're asking me to walk into whatever fortress he set up there and go face to face with him. If Thrawn isn't stopped, he'll be the one who eventually comes knocking at Cardass's retirement home, Calrissian said. If Cardass has any brains, he'll thank you for the warning. Cardass never thanked anyone for anything in his life, Card said bluntly. And he most certainly hasn't retired either. He'll be scheming or plotting something. That's the nature of the man. And he will not want to be found, particularly not by me. Calrissian hissed between his teeth. Fine, he bit out. You want to go bury yourself in a hole and wait for Thrawn to come dig you out, you go right ahead. Give me a copy of Mara's route to the Exocron system, and I'll go find him myself. Don't be absurd, Card said. You and the Lady Luck wouldn't last 2 days alone in the Cathal outback. Who says I'll be going alone? Calrissian countered. I thought I'd ask General Bella Bliss and the Peregrine along. That would be the absolute worst thing you could do, Card said, an edge of exasperation starting to color his tone. You bring a capital warship into the Exocron system, and Cardass will either go completely underground or blow it out of the sky. You don't know him the way I do. No, Calrissian agreed quietly. I don't. There was a long silence. A long, waiting silence. You should never have given up on your con man origins, Calrissian, Card said at last. You're far too good at it. All right. I'll go. Thanks, Calrissian said. You won't regret this. Don't make promises you can't keep, Card warned, his usual easy humor back in his voice. I suppose we should go break the news to the others. The door whispered open and the glow panel shut off, and as the room went dark again, Shada heaved herself up out of the hiding place. Rolling back across the bed and onto her feet, she crossed the room and slipped out just before the door closed again. The two men, Calrissian in the lead, were heading down the hallway toward the edge of what looked like an Alderaanian-style conversation circle, both of them completely oblivious to her presence behind them. Moving up, she fell into silent step behind Card. Okay, I give up, Han said, a puzzled look on his face. What was that all about? Leia shook her head. I don't know, she admitted, replaying the last exchange between Lando and Card in her mind as she gazed at the hallway where the two of them had disappeared towards the boy's bedroom. Some kind of secret they don't want us to know about. Yeah, I figured that much, Han said. What I meant was, what's the secret? Leia threw him one of her vast repertoire of patient looks, an inventory created by a lifetime of diplomatic service and honed to a fine art by 10 years of dealing with 3 boisterous children. You know I can't just go in and dig things out of their minds, she reminded him. It's not even ethical with enemies, let alone friends. You Jedi are no fun sometimes, Han said. His tone was bantering, but she could tell from his eyes and mood that he was still uneasy about the situation. We're not in the business to have fun, she pointed out. You couldn't just sort of stretch out and get a feel for what they're talking about in there? Leia smiled wryly. I wish you wouldn't do that, she admonished him. He pulled out one of his own repertoire of innocent looks. Do what? Suggest that I do something unethical right when I'm trying to persuade myself that it wouldn't hurt anyone, she told him. That's very disconcerting. Especially coming from a guy who isn't supposed to have near as good a conscience as you do, he suggested blandly. Leia rolled her eyes. I swear, Han, I think you can read my mind better without Jedi senses than I can read yours with them. He waved a hand. Professional secret. One of the things you learn as a scoundrel. Of course, Leia said, looking in the direction of the hallway again. I wonder how unethical it would be to send 3PO in to take notes for them. Lady Vader, a gravelly voice cut in. Leia jumped as usual. She hadn't heard or sensed the Nogri's approach. What is it, Garrick? Perhaps trouble, Garrick growled. The sentry on the rooftop is not responding to his comlink. Out of the corner of her eye, Leia saw Han roll slightly in his chair to loosen his blaster in its holster. You've sent a team to check on them? They are on the way, the Nogri said. But until we know otherwise, we must assume an intruder is attempting to break in. Where are the others? Down the hall, Leia said. Even as she pointed, she felt the subtle change in air pressure as the distant bedroom door slid open. That should be them now, she added, as the sound of approaching footsteps confirmed it. I would ask that you stay in this room for the present, Garrick said. As he spoke, Lando appeared around the corner, followed by Card. If there is an intruder, we will need to seek him out. Followed by a tall, slender woman dressed in a dark gray combat jumpsuit. Don't bother, the woman said quietly. I'm here. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.